Hi, I'm Michael Botsch.
I'm Jehdah Burton.
I'm Meredith Nowotarski.
And I'm Margaret Verst.
We're going to be talking about anti-racism in the classroom and what it looks like and who would be considered an anti-racist teacher and practices that an anti-racist teacher could implement into their classroom to further racial equity in schools. So to start off, we're going to be looking at what it means to be an anti-racist teacher and why it's important and what the impacts of that look like. So just to give a brief definition of what anti-racism looks like. So anti-racism is dismantling ideas that elevate whiteness and disadvantage Black and Indigenous people of color. So therefore, anti-racist education would be an educational system that upholds racial equity and removes barriers for students of color. So this would be the type of work that would be creating equity within your classroom. Whether it be starting in a school or starting in the classroom itself, it would be kind of expanding and making sure that all students of all races have equal opportunity within the classroom to be successful. And to continue, it's much more than a mindset. It definitely has dispositional aspects to it, but teachers must also do some self-reflection on how they themselves are racial individuals in a racialized society. Not everything is racist, but most things are racial. So we have to consider how our actions are impacting people of color within our classroom, and how what we are communicating, teaching, and expressing in our classrooms how that might have an impact on other individuals, whether it be intentional or something that's subconscious or conscious. Additionally, how could a school uphold racial institutions through things like discipline policies, faculty representation, school governance, or even things that we might not consider, such as attendance policies or things of that nature, where these are upholding standards that are based in race, but might not be considered racist, but they still uphold ideas of white supremacy. This is a quote from Jamila Pitts. She is a director of an anti-racist education program, and she discusses that anti-racist educators recognize that this is the work of undoing, of dismantling or liberating, of healing and of truth-telling, and this is a collective work of educators. So it should be important for all educators to consider this, not just people that are working with primarily Black and Indigenous people of color, but people from all over. This should be a priority to create a more equitable system. And then we also were looking at why it's important to be an anti-racist educator. So we need to do much more than just what would be considered multicultural education, which is putting multiple students of multiple different races in one room. It takes much more than simply location and that sort of change. We have to have a much different attitude and play an active role in the dismantling of racist systems. And so the recent transition from multicultural education to an anti-racist perspective asks teachers to do more than just assimilate and accommodate. They need to undo the work of racist institutions.
All right, and so as to several reasons why this is such a great imperative and why we should be trying to implement anti-racist teaching into our schools and our classrooms. As teachers, first and foremost, we're asked to educate our students both academically and morally. In the words of Blessed Basil Moreau, the mind should not be educated at the expense of the heart. And this is especially true in Catholic schools, but even in other public schools as well. So when we look at racism as an issue, it is indeed a moral issue that therefore needs to be addressed in classrooms if you consider yourself a moral educator. In order to make students good citizens and eventually moral adults, we're going to have to address the growing diversity that we see in the world and respond to all of the inequalities and inequities within our schools and also within life as students are growing to reach those spaces. And all of these inequities are preventing students of color from advancing or receiving equitable opportunities. And so these are things that we're going to want to make sure that we're combating and teaching them this in schools, so that way in the real world they're able to apply these things as well. And to continue to go into this why of anti-racist education, we have qualitative and quantitative impacts. So the qualitative impacts eventually lend towards the quantitative ones, but the ones that are qualitative focus on a tension between academic and cultural identities, especially within students of color and this mental turmoil they face going to schools. Because when we look at the way that schools tend to be formatted in these days, education is often centered on the narratives of those who are white, the Western history, Eurocentric subjects in music, in science, in history, and all of those ideals are very Westernized in general and have a very white focus. So students of color often don't see themselves represented. And although there has been a push with multicultural education to represent them, it's not always done so in a way that is respectful and dignifying. And for other statistics as to how this is affecting students of color, we see that in 2017 and 2018, looking at the actual populations of teachers serving in public schools, a shocking 79% of public school teachers are white and non-Hispanic. So that remaining 21% are all of our teachers of color. And among those teachers of color, they're usually serving in schools where their racial identity is the majority. But if we think about how those numbers work, even though, for example, if you have all of your African-American teachers serving in mostly African-American schools, there's still only 21%. So the majority of the teachers in that school are still going to be white, even if the students making up the racial majority are not. So we start to see this place where the adults who are shown as these academic symbols are also white, the education is white. And so it's creating this big sense of otherness that leads to this issue in constructing an academic identity. And so the reason we want to construct academic identities in students are this is what leads to academic resilience. And that's what's going to lead to things like low dropout rates, retention, and attendance, and then high GPAs, test scores, things like that, is having that academic resilience to stay in school and to keep performing at a high level, even in spite of difficulties in life. But that's hard to maintain when students of color are seeing media representations and meeting the societal expectations that are attaching academic achievement to their cultural identities in different ways, to where it can form this really big conflict between wanting to maintain that cultural and racial identity and maintaining an academic identity. And pursuing one over the other can seem like a betrayal, which can often lead to a really large source of conflict that can lead to some quantitative impacts. And then to talk about quantitative impacts as well, we particularly looked at some places where programs were involved in the great things that we saw come out of them quantitatively. So 2 examples that we had looked at is, one was a 9th grade ethnic studies course in San Francisco. And implementing this course, they took a group of 8th graders who had GPAs below threshold. And after taking this course, it caused actually some great increases in attendance, a 21% increase, a 1.4 grade point increase in their GPA, and an increase in credits by 23. This all considering they came from below threshold. And this was the work of this particular ethnic studies course in their 9th grade year. And another similar program in Oakland, California, that was focused more on fostering socio-emotional training and culturally relevant pedagogy, and also dealing with academic support and teaching African-American history as well in a dignified and edifying way. This program then resulted in these decreased dropout rates between 8.5% and 4.8% for African-American students, both male and female. So integrating these things into education, we've already seen in the research, does have great increases and positive effects on students of color that are already facing this sense of otherness in schools.
So next, we're going to look a little bit at who are the anti-racist teachers and what are the characteristics of an anti-racist educator. So in thinking about this, a lot of times what happens in any sort of professional field is there's a definition of what professionalism is. And so we really wanted to look and examine is what is the current day definition of professionalism and how do we recreate it to integrate aspects of anti-racism. So the current definition of professionalism in education, the norm is white-centered, white-dominated, and Western focused. So a high percentage of teachers are female and of our white descent, and it does not include all voices or experiences. There's an emphasis on teaching neutrality and developing impartial students, which doesn't encourage the questioning of systems that allow like that racism to permeate within structures. So what we see is a lot of times we want to protect the student and protect all students, which is great in a sense, but we really want to get to the core aspects of like, why do our students feel the way and why are there reasons that they're not comfortable coming to school? Professionalism is seen through the verbal commitment to diversity, which is also another problematic aspect. So we see a lot of initiatives and a lot of professional development that wants to integrate aspects of anti-racism, but once a year professional development isn't enough to really change the systems and dismantle the definition of professionalism at its core, which in turn allows us to dismantle the systematic problems within schools. So what we want to look at now is how do we actually redefine professional education in terms of anti-racist teaching? So there's a couple things that we can do to allow teachers to feel the sense of like anti-racism within themselves. So we really have to give educators the space to talk about their implicit biases and how these affect our students. So the best way to do this is having like sharing circles throughout the year where they really can get to the core and feel that sort of uncomfort within their school systems. But this really allows us to gain a sense of like how our implicit biases are really affecting our students. We really need to view anti-racism as deconstructive, and it's, again, not just an initiative. And so there was an article that we read that has 5 main factors that really led teachers to prioritize anti-racism in the classrooms. That includes like their personal experiences of racism, their experiences of other forms of oppression, political socialization, encounters with anti-racism in education, and experiences of racism in the professional teaching context. So this is really important because it allows those who are people of color to really have their voice be heard, because a ton of research has been done on the benefits of students of color having teachers of color. And so as many of our educators are white, allowing this space for professionals of color to share these experiences and how we best serve our students of color is really important. And our last topic, we're going to focus on how does one actually incorporate anti-racist teaching into the classroom. So now we know the why, we know who the anti-racist teacher is and how do we develop them. But now we want to give you guys some ideas on how to actually integrate anti-racism techniques into your classroom. So one thing we really wanted to focus on is like fair grading system. So a lot of times what happens is we have these implicit biases and we might not realize that they're affecting the way that we're grading student work. And the reason this is so important is because student work really it's an integral piece of our system and it allows our students to make advances, whether that's applying to colleges, advancing through the next grade level, or even just having some sort of self-esteem and connection to their grades. So there's a couple different strategies that we're going to go through that you guys can integrate in your classes. But just giving a definition of grading bias, it's really when you give certain grades, which is they essentially have the same quality, but it's based on your impact with different students. So a couple strategies that I've used this year and that are backed by research. So exchanged grading and collaborative grading is when exchange grading is when a faculty that teaches the same subject as you will grade the assessment of other sections. So this works in relatively larger schools, but if you're somebody who works in a smaller school, you can look for another educator who maybe has some experience in your field, whether that's an Algebra 1 teacher and they grade your geometry assessments. They just have to have some high level of experience within your field. Collaborative grading also is when multiple teachers grade a single assessment. So it's kind of like you all sit in a circle and you all go through and grade it. And if there are discrepancies that could indicate bias, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is some sort of bias there. It's just, it probably should be looked at again within that piece. Spaced repeating scoring is when you grade the assessment, you record the data, and then you regrade it a couple of days later. And this can really help with if there's like an event with a student, getting that space to go back and see if your experience with that student really affected the grade you assigned them. And the last thing and the most beneficial thing to use is rubrics. So rubrics really lay out what is expected of the students. And there's actually a study done on rubrics where teachers were given 2 assessments, one with the name that was associated with African Americans and another one that was associated with a more white sounding name. And when there was no rubric present, teachers were 4.7% we're giving 4.7% more points to the student with the white sounding name versus the African American sounding name. But when rubrics were introduced, there was only 0.6% more points assigned to the student with the white sounding name. And this is really key and a really great reason to integrate rubrics as an anti-racist technique.
So another strategy that is very emphasized throughout different psychology studies is focuses on how we discuss racism and anti-racism within our classrooms. And one point that is very strongly supported is this idea that we need to center our student voices. So we want to engage our students in anti-racist discussions and actions. You need to be willing to have these discussions within your classroom, because what we devote our class time to and what we ignore really communicates a lot about how we feel about these things. So we want to directly involve our students and allow them to share their experiences authentically. One way that researchers found was very effective is by letting students share counter stories in which they can kind of share things that they've experienced with their classmates, and this helps their classmates to see how racism actually affects these peers, and they can see the prevalence of racism more so than just when the teacher is trying to tell them that racism exists. Getting to hear those authentic stories really makes it very clear to them that this is not an issue that they are removed from. However, we want to make sure in our classrooms that we're not requiring students of color to be witnesses to these white students who are working out their own racism. You never want to put a student of color on the spot to kind of speak to the issue. They should be welcomed and feel comfortable sharing their experiences, but you don't want to single them out and require them to share. Another point is that you as a teacher, you are a leader in the classroom, so you should be vulnerable and open about the work that you are trying to do to implement anti-racism within your classroom, and you should be honest about the growth that you are making and the ways that you are learning about anti-racism, but you should not be dominating this conversation. It should be student-led, and it should prioritize the students' voices over your own. In addition to just being willing to have these discussions with your students, you want to be aware of and responsive to any range of potential student reactions as you're having these discussions. In a study by Wagner, they found that potential student reactions can range from white students feeling paralyzed by guilt and therefore not wanting to participate in this conversation. Students of color can adopt silence as a form of resistance, and discussions can collapse into anger and frustration and an inability to believe that the sides can really learn from one another. So all of these reactions can really stop the conversation short and create some tension within the classroom. So you need to be prepared and willing to kind of cross these bridges as you come to them, because it is a very sensitive subject for some people, and you need to be clear upfront about your expectations for this discussion so that all of your students feel comfortable engaging in this discussion, even if they are experiencing discomfort with the actual topic. So that kind of leads into your classroom culture and the way that you engage with your students throughout the school year, but you want to create an understanding that all students have a responsibility to participate in this discussion, because all of them should want to arrive at a role of empowerment and allyship rather than guilt or passivity when we're discussing racism and anti-racism. Furthermore, you want to clarify that discomfort in discussing racism and anti-racism is a result of privilege and oppression itself. So safety is not guaranteed for Black and Indigenous people of color in discussions of racism. So the idea that your students are going to be able to feel safe or comfortable in discussing it is a flawed argument, and you have to kind of establish that beforehand so that the students can recognize that it's okay to feel discomfort in this, because we are doing work that matters, and we need to recognize that, like, even with this discomfort, we can feel empowered to have these important conversations. In a study by Peterson, Walker, and Wise, they found that there were a couple strategies that worked on an individual and interpersonal level. And they kind of went through and discussed how these can have varying levels of success when taken individually or independently of one another, but when you combine these, it can have a much stronger effect. So individually, we want to provide your students with information about culture issues. So, again, just making sure that you are addressing things that are happening in the world and not just kind of ignoring it and moving on. If your students want to discuss an issue, like be willing to have that conversation with them while still setting boundaries about like what you are using your class time for. Next, they want to invite you to induce dissonance within your students. So if you have a student who says that they have very egalitarian views about like, yes, prejudice is bad, racism is bad, but then they kind of are expressing actions or verbalizing any sort of prejudice against a certain group, you should address that and talk to them about it and kind of make them realize that what they're saying is not lining up with their actions. So kind of inducing that dissonance and making them realize that I need to reevaluate what I'm saying and what I'm doing. That can really help to make them understand. And then so you want to invoke empathy in your students as well, encourage them to take other people's perspectives and points of view, especially those who have different experiences of them. It's also really wonderful in a Catholic school, we have the opportunity to try to instill morals within our students. So inviting them to experience empathy and take other people's points of view is really important for that as well. And then interpersonally, the researchers found that intergroup contact can be really helpful as long as you are making sure that the groups are not in conflict with each other as far as like what the goal is of this contact. So I'll talk to that a little bit more in the main takeaways section, but essentially you want to invite people from different groups to interact with each other. And then providing consensus information. So if you are going to share with students that if they are holding a particular view against a certain group, but not everybody feels that way, that can invite students to evaluate their biases and maybe reconsider how they are thinking about a particular group. And lastly, this willingness to engage in dialogue, like I said before, just being willing to have these conversations does have an effect. So don't shy away from that. So the main takeaways from the study, it's important to involve the audience. You want to emphasize both commonality and diversity. So we want to focus more on the commonalities between different groups of people, because while we do want to celebrate differences, we don't want to overemphasize these differences, because we should be trying to work together and feel more unified than more in conflict with one another. They said it would be best to focus on changing behaviors and attitudes, and more so it was found to be more effective to maybe start with changing behaviors before trying to address the attitudes. Sometimes the inclination is to address attitudes first, but behaviors can be a little bit easier to call out and redirect. And then lastly, you want to tailor your anti-racist efforts to meet both the local needs and the broader context. So making sure that you are tailoring it to your specific school community while still considering what's happening in the world. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our presentation. We have our references listed in case you would like to follow up on any of the research that we found, but please let us know if you have any questions.